For many of us who've come from conflict-prone communities, conflict-prone countries, and conflict-prone continent, the mainstream neoliberal conversation around dealing with the issues of intractable wars has been around the idea of how we can amicably resolve the conflict between the warring parties. And what has been quite dominant has been this idea that what motivates intractable wars, again within the neoliberal tradition, is the question of power and is the question of resource. So inbuilt is this assumption that if we have to reduce or end the intractable conflict, we have to think around how to share power, how to share resources. And so this has been the classical attempt for a very long time, that the intractable wars can be resolved by trying to see how to maximally become charitable with each other, the warring parties, by trying to come back or draw nearer the negotiating table, and we negotiate particularly in this area of power and resource. And power, we are talking about political power, we are talking about resource. Today we want to go through this assumption, we want to go through this tradition, we want to go through this mainstream literature and mainstream discussion. And as a result, our topic today, our discussion point today is merchants of power sharing in Africa's intractable wars, ambiguities in the neoliberal logic. What's the problem? How do we start this? We want to say that most negotiated power sharing between governments and rebel groups in Africa have failed. Cases: 1993 Arusha Accord, Juvenal Habyarimana and Paul Kagame's Rwandan Patriotic Front failed. The Arusha Accord failed. The 1985 Tito Okello Lutwa junta and Yoweri Museveni's National Resistance Army in Nairobi also failed. 2002 Sun City in South Africa between Joseph Kabila, that is Joseph Laurent Kabila Sr., and Jean-Pierre Bemba's movement for the liberation of Congo and the Congolese rally for democracy. All could not agree, and it collapsed. In 1999, the Lome Convention, the Lome Peace Accord between the government of Sierra Leone of Tejan Kaba and Revolutionary United Front of Fode Sanko, it failed. 2015, Addis Ababa, Salva Kiir and Riek Machar's Sudanese People's Liberation Army in opposition, SPLA-O. How do we explain this collapse? How do we explain this collapse? It is clear, and we could have gone on and on and on, but it's time to begin to reflect on these assumptions. And we want to say, first, by looking at the architecture debate of the neoliberal tradition. And the source of this neoliberal tradition of power sharing comes from the tradition of consociational democracy, which has been supported by United Nations, African Union, Intergovernmental Authority for Development, IGAD. But we also see that there's also been a sense of resistance. And here Jeremy Levitt talks about illegal peace, contesting legality of power sharing, what he calls coercing democracy. How do we problematize neoliberal architecture? First, from the aspect of empathy. Through friend Osler Hampson's refute of good neoliberal peace paper, that yes, we can share power, we can share the resources, but there's something that goes further than sharing of power and resources to the problems in the mind and in the hearts. And that is something that we need to deal with much more. And that which is in the heart, that which is in the mind, actually caused the war. The aspect of power, the aspect of resource or political power and resource are simply a political rationality to explain the intractable wars. But deeper, the underneath is a question of empathy. How do we understand each other? What has been an attitude and mindset around each other? Is a deeper problem, is a deeper scenario that needs to be investigated. And Marshall Rosenberg actually tries to take us to this domain of empathy. And of course, we see that in the onion conflict analysis, that shifts us from want to need, and the need is greater than resource, the need is greater than power. And of course, Martin Buber, that takes us more into the aspect of humanity, shifting us from simply being human beings into human persons with a dignity. The question of dignity is more premium, more foundational than issues of power and resource. So, what do we see here that is beyond power, that is beyond resource? And it is this idea of empathy which can construct itself in a more complex way beyond power and resource. And that has created and that has given us a leeway to go beyond the neoliberal tradition of power and resource, because we are saying that the deeper problem is issues of empathy, issues of attitude, issues of relationships, issues of narratives about ourselves, issue of history, and how we've been looking at each other, which goes beyond power question, goes beyond resource question. And so we want to go beyond the neoliberal architecture, and we want to start more from the issue of colonial and post-colonial discourse. That the intractable conflict builds and hinges itself beyond power discussion and resource to questions of natives and settlers. This is a construct we see popular in Mahmoud Mamdan's 2001 framework to understand the relation between the Hutu and the Tutsi in Rwanda, to an extent that power sharing could not help, to an extent that resource could not help. This question of natives and settlers, which we are going to tackle a little later in another PowerPoint. For now, one can follow this complex relation between the idea that we are natives and the idea that you are simply settlers. In Acholi, where I come from, it's this question of one Lupajo and one Adonye, the complexity of Lupajo and Adonye. In other words, the complexity of us, the natives, and then you, the settlers, is a bigger question that transcends how much we can share as a power and resources. So, what that therefore means is that power sharing in Africa cannot work. It's a precarious terrain, and we need to shift beyond that and begin to look more into the complexities that we've already posed, beyond simply power, beyond simply resources as it were. So what do we do here? To understand this complexity of intractable wars that power sharing cannot help, particularly sharing of power and resource, we want to build on the idea of empathy, to build on the idea of relations, to build on the idea of feelings, attitude about ourselves and the history we have about ourselves, to take us into a more deeper theoretical conversation on what we are calling as critical theory, deploying critical theory in understanding the conflicts or the intractable wars. And we want to draw more from Michel Foucault's methodological and epistemic technique of archaeology and genealogy in understanding the central role of power. I mean, not just as political power, but power in its generic sense, the epistemic power, relational power, the power of history, and on and on and on, and hegemony in all its dimensions, beyond simply the political and the resource. And to help us understand this, we want to build on Mahmoud Mamdan's How Europe Ruled Africa. And this is quite important, trying to look at the different complex, relationships that were built, histories that were built, identities that were built, and all these became power dimensions beyond political power, beyond resource, and all contributed to what currently we see as intractable conflicts and wars in Africa. And that means how Europe ruled Africa begins to shift us from the mainstream discussion that has been popular, that is how Europe underdeveloped Africa, from Walter Rodney. Thank you.